Welcome to Famine, Affluence, and Morality, and a reply to Singer. The first article is by Peter Singer, and the reply is written by Travis Timmerman. The first article starts on page 447 in your textbook. So, in the previous two screencasts, we talked about the moral problem of abortion, and now we're going to talk about the moral problem of poverty and extreme suffering. So the question that is central to Singer is, what obligations do we have to other people? And the argument he presents in this paper has been very influential. He wrote it in the early 1970s, and it's still talked about today and debated. He argues the overall conclusion is going to be that our understanding of the absolute minimum of what we owe to one another in order to be a good person is very different to the one that's generally accepted. In short, we need to do way more for other people to claim that we're morally good than we currently do, or who we ought to be are people who help others more. So our common sense understanding of our moral obligation to others is generally a negative one. And what that means in the sense of rights or what we owe to people is that we just don't interfere or bother them. Don't interfere with their lives or their rights. We leave them alone as much as possible. That's a negative conception of rights, or a negative conception of what a moral obligation is. Singer argues that our moral obligation to people should be a positive one, which means we should actually act in the world to alleviate and prevent suffering if we can. And this means that he means that we're actually obligated, not that it would be really good if we did, that we're morally compelled to alleviate suffering if we can. So he lists a lot of cases in his introduction of suffering that was occurring all over the world while he was writing in the early 70s. You can take a look at his examples. Let's see. First he said, constant poverty, cyclones, civil war have turned millions of people destitute in East Bengal. Lack of food, shelter, and medical care. So this kind of event isn't unusual. It's happening all over the world as we speak. And the things he considers aren't mild inconveniences. They're life or death, like starvation, extreme poverty, war, genocide, torture, abduction, sexual assault. And these things are all daily parts of millions or even billions of people's lives. On page 448, he says, if it's in our power to prevent something bad from happening, meaning these kinds of bads, not all bads, without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. To demonstrate what he means by comparable moral importance, so means exactly on the same plane of moral import. So we might think life and death situations are a lot more important than non-life or death situations. So Singer gives a really short thought experiment. He says, if we walk by a child drowning in a shallow pond, it is absolutely uncontroversial that we should rescue him. It's a muddy pond, but it's shallow. We have no chance of drowning. We would stop his death. Maybe we are on our way to a special occasion and we're wearing our best clothes, that are our most expensive clothes, and they'll be ruined. We are experiencing a moral loss, the way things ought to be, remember, but it's very incredibly trivial compared to the loss of life that the child would suffer if we didn't save him. And Singer draws a direct line from that instance to the people who are suffering life or death situations all over the world right now. They are suffering substantial moral loss, and they are no different to this child that we walked past. So there ought to be a baseline lack of suffering in this extremely important moral sense that every person in the world gets to have. And we are obligated to help them get to that state if it's in our power. The immediate counter-argument is proximity. Of course, we should save that child because we're right next to him, but a lot of the people that are suffering are very far away, and I can't do much about it. And he dismisses that almost immediately because he gives a couple of pages, well, a couple of paragraphs, of justification, but it comes down to the idea that our world is increasingly globalized, and it's not that hard to send our resources to anywhere in the world. We can just use our phones. Well, we couldn't in the 70s, but now we can just text, and some of our resources will get sent to anywhere in the world, no matter how remote. So the proximity argument doesn't work for Singer, and the next objection to his argument comes in the idea that there are so many people in the world suffering, billions, and there are also billions of people that have equal amount of wealth, comparative wealth, to us. Everybody in the first world versus everybody in the third world, basically. So two things with the volume argument. Anything I do will be a drop in the bucket. And from the other side, with the volume of people who are comparably wealthy to me, why should I be the one to give my resources away when all of them are doing nothing? So this objection comes down to the idea that, one, we can't do much as individuals by ourselves in the face of the largest of the problem, and two, I don't have the obligation to give all of my excess wealth away when other people won't, even though there's lots of them. So Singer argues against this counter-argument. Let's see, on the bottom of page 449. And he says this one's pretty easy to dismiss as well, because by saying what is the case is not what the case ought to be. He says we all, every single one of us, if you take the counter-argument seriously, have a real responsibility in maintaining the unequal status quo. And we live in a very unequal wealth distribution, and we take advantage of that by utilizing most of the resources. We all take a share in the responsibility for the extreme moral duress that people around the world suffer. And neither the fact that there are a lot of people to help, nor that there are a lot of wealthy people, do not justify inaction. They are just an argument for inactivity and apathy. And then he says, even if this volume of people on both sides of the issue had any sort of traction, you might conclude, okay, well, if everyone's responsible, then I should only help give my fair share. And that's fine. If you thought that that was Singer's argument, you might say, okay, I agree with that. I'll send my $5 after this tsunami. But this isn't what Singer's arguing for. He thinks all of us who are on the higher half of the wealth gap have an obligation to give as much as we can without losing basic moral necessities. That's what he means by comparable moral goods. So he also points to the real world where everyone doesn't give their fair share. So if you donate $5 to the tsunami relief, there's still not going to be enough food, water, and shelter in the place where people need those resources. So that means in order to be morally good, everyone should give everything that they can. So that might mean that you pay your rent and your food and you give the rest of your wealth away. And Singer notes that this might seem like it has an absurd conclusion, because if everybody did that, there'd be way too many resources for one disaster. But he notes that This only happens if there's bad communication, because if people started to donate in this way, they would have enough resources, and then the people who haven't donated yet would just donate to the next extreme situation. So you can see that this is a really redistributive idea of what morality entails, at least up to the point in which everybody doesn't suffer these major moral losses. Okay, so if you buy this argument that we should give up to the point where we're only ensured the basic necessities, it changes the very essence of our normal moral categorization, of the way we think the world ought to be, of the way we think our behavior ought to be. We normally have two different ideas of moral action. What we have a duty to do, which maybe universally is care for your children, and charity, action that's good to do, but you're not obligated to do. So duty is what you must do in order to be morally good. Charity is what we choose to do to be morally good. And Singer's argument redraws the lines between duty and charity. He says there still might be charity out there. He doesn't know where the line would get pushed to if it was possible to redraw it. But if you buy his argument, duty starts to be a much bigger category than it is for most people today. Giving is a duty. We would have to give up a lot of consumer goods, a lot of entertainment. If you commit to the strong version of Singer's conclusion, and I'll mention the strong and weak versions in a minute, you also have to give up things like savings and maybe health insurance until all of this life or death suffering is gone out of the world, at least all that we can prevent. And Singer says this loss of enjoyment, or a safety net, I guess, is not in the same moral category as the absence of the basic necessities. Sure, it's important in an ideal world to save for future rainy days, but we don't live in an ideal world, and the basic necessities are never going to be superseded as the most important moral category. Remember, these are the life or death things: starvation, lack of violence, shelter, water, food. And the loss of enjoyment can never be as important, so it can't be used as a counter argument. Now, the quote I have up there, you can see, is kind of similar to Singer's conclusion, and Owen Feltham wrote in the 1700s. So it's not like this is a new idea, but exactly the formulation of why we need to redraw the lines of moral obligation is a bit different. This is a simple change in the drawing of our theory about what moral behavior should be. You're just moving the line between duty and charity a tiny bit. But it would have radical behavioral consequences, especially in the comparatively wealthy world, because there's a really high level of wealth inequality in our world. And of course, it's even greater than when Singer was writing in the 70s. So changing our actions in the way he proposes would alter our behavior tremendously. And this drasticness, this absolutely massive shift that we would have to entail, could be an objection to the argument. And Singer says it's not a good objection because the way people react emotionally or psychologically is not a good justification. Just because it feels drastic doesn't mean that's a good argument to not change your behavior. Another objection is that it's too morally strict. Just like utilitarianism got this argument, ACT utilitarianism, the people who are giving would have no rest, no relaxation, no any positive utility in their life, because they'd have to spend every waking moment and resource helping other people, and that's just way too strict. And Singer says this isn't the case, because the limit to duty isn't when you start exhausting yourself to death. It's when it starts to take away the affluent person's basic moral necessities. So you'll always have rest, and you'll always have food and shelter and water and freedom from violence. And you'll suffer some discomfort maybe, because you're not used to limiting yourself in this way, but it still doesn't compare to the suffering and life or death situations of those without basic moral necessities. So here are the strong and weak versions. The strong version that we've been talking about up until now would require the comparatively wealthy to give until they hit marginal utility. That's an economic term that Singer appropriates and shifts a little bit to mean that you have to give until you're just about as well off as the poorest people in the world. So the goal is to redistribute until everybody at least has their basic needs met before we start worrying about building up wealth. You give until you had the bare minimum. But he says, even if you weaken it, even if you make it easier to achieve, it would still mean that we had to change our behavior very radically. So the strong version says comparable moral significance, which means life or death situations. And the weaker version is anything morally significant. So anything about the way you think the world ought to be. You think your children ought to have a college fund. So in the weaker version, that's let back in. You think you ought to have insurance. So that's let back in. But going to the movies and buying new clothes or makeup or gym memberships or good dinners at a restaurant, that's all still out. So even in the weak version, we would have to alter our behavior drastically. Before we move on to Timmerman's reply, I would like you to take a look at some other examples that Singer has. He talks about what might have to change as a function of the gross national product. And at the time he was talking, I don't actually know what it is now, the United States had determined that about 1% of our gross national product was for giving to people in these life or death situations around the world. And he has a question of, well, what percentage of that gross national product should it be in order to maintain our wealth so we can give it to people? So it does get a little bit muddled, and the practical issues of exactly what that bare minimum is are far from settled. But he thinks, in conclusion, that he's demonstrated that we positively owe more than we give to other people. Travis Timmerman's reply is printed right directly after Singer's article, and it's a little bit shorter and right to the point. He says that we're not obligated to save the drowning child, so you might think that this has echoes of Jarvis Thompson. We're not morally obligated to help others using our resources, but we can choose to do so if we want to. This might seem outrageous right at the beginning if you're thinking about Singer's argument, wherein all that you lose is your expensive clothing. So, also hearkening back to Jarvis Thompson, you still might not owe them, but it would be morally repugnant to refuse to help people or shelter people or let them use your resources when the demand on you is very low. Yet, Timmerman still says that Singer's thought experiment is flawed because it assumes that the child drowning is a rare occurrence, but in real life, suffering is not rare. It might seem obvious that you should sacrifice, say, your expensive clothes once. They cost about $200 is his point there. But no one should be expected to sacrifice $200 every single day, multiple times a day for the rest of their lives. Now, you might recall that Singer discussed this objection, that we psychologically balk at changing our behavior so drastically because it's an emotional reaction and we're stubborn and maybe even a little bit childlike because we don't want to give up our toys and our luxuries. So that was Peter Singer rejecting this similar kind of argument that Timmerman is making. Too bad that you have to give $200 up multiple times a day for the rest of your life. Life or death situations are still more important. But Timmerman says it's not a psychological reaction and that there's moral justification in the person that argues you should have some positive utility in your life, even if you're more affluent than others. He has a counter thought experiment, which might strike you as a little bit silly, but remember again that this is trying to make a logical point. This is on page 456. Unlucky Lisa gets a call from her 24-hour bank telling her that hackers have accessed her account and are taking $200 out of it every 5 minutes until Lisa shows up in person to put a hold on her account. Due to some legal loophole, the bank is not required to reimburse Lisa for any of the money she may lose, nor will they. In fact, if her account is overdrawn, the bank will seize as much of her assets as needed to pay the debt created by the hackers. Fortunately for Lisa, the bank is just across the street from her work, and she can get there in fewer than 5 minutes. She was even about to walk to the bank as part of her daily routine. On her way, Lisa notices a vast space of land covered with hundreds of newly formed shallow ponds, each of which contains a small child who will drown unless someone pulls them to safety. Lisa knows that for each child she rescues, an extra child will live who would have otherwise died. Now, it would take Lisa approximately 5 minutes to pull each child to safety, and in what can only be the most horrifically surreal day of her life, Lisa has to decide how many children to rescue before entering the bank. Once she enters the bank, all the children who have not yet been rescued will drown. Things only get worse for poor Lisa. For the remainder of her life, the hackers repeat their actions on a daily basis, and every day the ponds adjacent to Lisa's bank are filled with drowning children. Now, of course, this is a ridiculous story, but it also is the fact of the matter for people who are comparatively wealthy in this world. As Singer conceded, there are billions of people suffering life or death, moral losses right now all over the world. And if you were truly committed to Singer's conclusion of redrawing the lines between duty and charity, your situation would be like Lisa's. You would have to work hard to build wealth every day just to give it away. You would be able to do nothing else ever. And his conclusion is that given the enormousness of the sacrifices that the affluent would have to take on board to get them down to marginal utility, it's morally permissible to build some utility for yourself. And you can do this a non-trivial number of times. I have enjoyment here, but utility is a better word probably, because it's basically saying that you have a right to some utility in your life, even though you were blessed with moral luck and the idea that in this world with great disparity, you happen to end up on the better end. This doesn't alleviate your responsibility to help others, but it does show that the counter-argument of drastic change is stronger than Peter Singer allowed it to be. So Singer has the weak and the strong version, of course. So you might be thinking, well, what about the weak version? But even in both cases, large sacrifices are required. And what Timmerman is saying is that even quote-unquote trivial utilities, like enjoying television or going out to a restaurant to have a good meal, are still morally permissible sometimes. People have a right to get some amount of pleasure from their lives, even if that pleasure is gained through using wealth that could have otherwise contributed to someone else's basic needs. Excuse me. In conclusion, I'd like you to think about Singer's argument and Timmerman's response, and also what moral obligation means to you.